The old man's presence was impossible to ignore the moment he entered the Imperial Trust Bank. His weathered face, hidden beneath a layer of gray stubble, carried the weight of decades of struggle. His clothes were tattered, his shoes barely held together with thick strands of thread. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught attention. It was the sack he carried, swinging gently at his side, its contents a mystery that seemed to defy reason. The customers in the bank stopped talking, their eyes quickly darting to him, sizing him up with thinly veiled disdain. The security guard shifted uneasily, adjusting his uniform, unsure of what to do with a man who seemed so out of place in the sleek, pristine world of this high-end establishment. The teller at the counter, Jessica, rolled her eyes as the old man shuffled closer, his feet dragging across the polished marble floor. His ragged sack bounced against his leg with each step, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. The faint smell of the street, of old sweat, dirt, and neglect, lingered in the air, settling like a cloud around him. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" Jessica asked, her voice laced with condescension. She leaned forward, preparing to turn him away politely. The old man looked up at her, his eyes dark and mysterious, hiding something deep within. The corners of his mouth twitched into what might have been the faintest smile. Without responding, he reached into the sack. The room fell silent. One by one, people in the bank leaned forward, intrigued by what he might pull out. A large, rusted lock? A bundle of old receipts? Something that made him stand out even more in his shabby condition. But when he finally lifted the object from the sack, the entire room gasped. It was a thick, leather-bound document, frayed and aged, as though it had been passed down through generations. The gold letters on the cover were almost faded, but just visible enough to read, "The Imperial Trust Bank." A murmur spread through the room. Jessica's smile faded as she noticed the man's intense gaze on her, and her hand froze mid-air. He took one slow, deliberate step forward and placed the document gently on the counter. "This bank," the old man began, his voice low but steady, "was once mine." A cold laugh escaped from one of the customers sitting by the window, trying to mask the tension with humor. "Sure, Grandpa. What are you trying to pull here? This bank was built in the 1800s. Jessica, still staring at the document, glanced over to the security guard, her lips curling into a thin, amused smile. "It's clearly a fake. Some old man looking for attention." But the man did not falter. His eyes were unwavering. His voice was calm, almost chilling as he spoke again. "I came to reclaim what's mine." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The laughter died away. No one dared to speak as the teller blinked, unsure of what to do next. In a flash, her smugness was replaced with a nervous uncertainty. I don't understand, sir. You're claiming ownership of this bank?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man gave her a knowing look, as if he had seen this moment unfold 1,000 times before. His lips parted, ready to speak again, but just as he opened his mouth, a loud voice broke through the room. "Get that old fool out of here!" a man's voice bellowed from across the room. "We don't need any more trouble." The security guard immediately rushed over, his hand raised in warning, but the old man stood his ground, his eyes narrowing in anger. The tension in the air thickened. "I am not a fool," he said quietly, but firmly, "and I am not leaving until you understand the truth." The security guard, now visibly irritated, grabbed the man by the arm, attempting to escort him out. But the old man's grip on the sack tightened. Before anyone could react, he swung the sack open. A cloud of dust rose into the air, and inside the sack, beneath the rotting fabric, were stacks of money. What came out wasn't some forgotten relic. It wasn't some faded piece of the past. It was something that should have been impossible, something that was far more valuable than the rest of the room could ever have imagined. It was a stack of old weathered banknotes, thick, crinkled bills, stained with age, their edges curling and fragile. The ink was faded, and the paper was torn at the corners, but the weight of the money was undeniable. The bills weren't modern currency. No, they were from an era long gone. These were Imperial Trust Bank notes from 1912, the kind of currency that had been used in Amos Jackson's prime, his family's pride. Each bill was a testament to the wealth and influence his family had held, a symbol of the empire they had once built. The bills themselves, a dull greenish hue, were stamped with the bank's logo, the faded gold lettering on the front, barely legible, but unmistakable. The words, "The Imperial Trust Bank," stood out, a mark of an era that was being resurrected in the most unexpected of ways. A murmur swept through the room. The customers, once smug and dismissive, now exchanged confused glances, some stepping back, others inching forward, as if the old man's presence had somehow imbued the room with a palpable sense of history that no one could ignore. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen anything like this before. The currency, though tattered, had weight. It wasn't just old money. It was real money, and it represented something far more significant than just a forgotten past. This was part of a story, a legacy that had been hidden, buried under layers of lies and corruption. The old man had come to claim it back. She watched in disbelief as the old man placed the stack of bills on the counter, his fingers tracing the edges of the notes with a reverence that only someone who had been robbed of their legacy could understand. The room went completely still. The air was charged with disbelief. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The old man stood tall, his back straight, a slight smile creeping onto his face as he watched the chaos around him unfold. "You see, I told you," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight no one could ignore. "This bank, it is mine." Amos Jackson had once been a prominent figure in his community, a prosperous man who had built the Imperial Trust Bank from the ground up in 1887. But that was before the bank had been stolen from him and his family. Back then, Amos had been a successful businessman, respected and admired. But in 1912, amidst a financial scandal and racial discrimination, his wealth was siphoned away, and his bank, his life's work, was forcibly taken from him through a series of underhanded actions carried out by a powerful group of businessmen and politicians who sought to solidify their own financial dominance. Amos Jackson, devastated by the loss, spent decades fighting to get the Imperial Trust Bank back. He spent countless hours in legal battles, trying to expose the corruption and injustice of those powerful men. As the years went by, the hope of reclaiming what was rightfully his slowly faded, and the world began to forget his name. The true story of the bank and its rightful owner became buried under layers of deception and greed. Amos hadn't given up, even as years of struggle and poverty had worn him down. He had spent decades researching, fighting for the recognition of what had been taken from him, and now, in the face of all odds, he was here. He was here to reclaim his legacy. This wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about showing that even the smallest voices could rise up and be heard. He was done being invisible. He was done being ignored. The documents he now carried with him told the story of a family legacy lost to greed and exploitation, a history that had been buried, forgotten by the world. Now, decades later, he has returned, determined to reclaim not just the physical bank, but also the dignity and legacy of his family, no longer willing to let the corrupt system go unchallenged. Amos Jackson didn't flinch. He stood tall, holding the money in his hands like a tangible symbol of everything that had been taken from him. His voice, when he spoke again, was quiet, but filled with the power of someone who had waited far too long to be heard. "This bank," Amos said, his voice clear and unwavering, "was built by the labor of my ancestors. People like me. People who were told their labor didn't matter. People whose contributions were erased, hidden, swept under the rug so that others could take what was ours." He stepped closer to the counter, the worn bills still held tightly in his hands. "This place was never just a business. It was a family legacy, but it was stolen. And I'm here to take it back." Jessica's heart thudded in her chest as she listened to Amos speak. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that the world she knew was the only one that mattered. But now, standing here, watching this old man reclaim not just his bank, but his dignity, she realized how small her own world had been. She had been a cog in a machine that had long crushed people like him, people who had worked, bled, and sacrificed for the wealth and comfort of others. And now that machine was crumbling. He placed the stack of bills carefully on the counter and turned to Jessica, his eyes steady and expectant. The room felt smaller now, as if all eyes were on her, waiting for her to make a decision. The security guard stood by, looking uncertain, his hands hovering at his sides. But there was something in the air now, something that told him, just like everyone else, that this wasn't an ordinary situation. The tension in the bank was unbearable, like a tight knot in the pit of every stomach. Everyone had fallen into a deep, almost eerie silence, save for the rustling of paper and the distant hum of the overhead lights. The air, once crisp and fresh, now felt thick and heavy, clinging to the skin like the weight of the old man's presence. There was a sense of discomfort spreading rapidly through the room, an unsettling feeling that no one could ignore. The customers, once so smug in their pristine clothes and polished shoes, now shifted nervously in their seats, avoiding his piercing gaze. Jessica, still standing behind the counter, was caught between disbelief and a flicker of fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the phone, her fingers brushing the receiver but unable to grasp it fully. Her mind was spinning. Was this some sort of joke? A prank? How could this old, dirty man with his sack of crumpled bills possibly have a claim to a prestigious institution like the Imperial Trust Bank? She glanced nervously at the security guard, who was standing nearby, unsure of what to do next. His face was flushed with embarrassment, and his broad shoulders sagged under the weight of the situation. This wasn't just any ordinary man walking in. This was a black man who dared to walk into this establishment, a place where people like him were not welcome, let alone allowed to stake a claim. Amos's eyes narrowed as he looked at Jessica, his voice suddenly laced with a kind of cold authority that chilled her to the bone. "You don't have to believe me," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "But I've walked these streets longer than any of you. I've seen your kind in every corner of this city, shuffling in and out of your shiny offices, walking past me without a second thought. You all look the same, wealthy, self-assured, and blind." His voice was low, but powerful, vibrating with a deep, unspoken truth. "But I'm not here to ask for your trust. I've been through worse than what you can imagine." Jessica couldn't help herself. The disgust that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long bubbled up in her chest, a sneering contempt for the man in front of her. She had heard the whispers, seen the looks of judgment. To her, he wasn't a person. He was an obstacle, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. She wanted him out of her sight, out of her space. "You don't belong here," she sneered, the words dripping from her lips. She was doing everything she could to suppress her rising anger, but it was futile. "This is a bank, not a charity. People like you have no business in a place like this." Amos's eyes flickered with something dark, a hint of pain or perhaps bitterness. But he didn't rise to her bait. Instead, he stood there, rooted to the floor, watching her with the calm of someone who had been through far more than any of them could ever understand. "You think I don't know what it's like to be treated like a ghost?" His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "You think I don't know the feeling of being invisible, dismissed, ignored, like I don't matter." The other customers exchanged uneasy glances, some looking at their watches, others glaring at the man with narrowed eyes, uncomfortable in their expensive suits. One man, in a dark blue business suit, finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Just call the cops already. This old fool is wasting our time." The harshness of his words stung in the air, and the sharpness of his tone made the old man flinch, just barely. But it was enough. "You're the fool," Amos said softly, but with an unmistakable fury in his eyes. "You sit there, on your high horse, judging me because of what I look like, because of where I've come from. But don't you dare forget, I know what it means to rise from the bottom. I know the weight of hard work. I've carried it on my shoulders for years. Your precious bank, your shiny suits, they're built on the blood, sweat, and tears of people like me." The room was completely still. The security guard was standing by the door now, unsure of whether to intervene, yet frozen in place. Jessica's cheeks burned as she struggled to find words, but they eluded her. She had never been confronted like this before. Her arrogance was crumbling, dissolving before her eyes. "You see," Amos continued, his voice now rising in volume, filled with raw emotion, "when the world treats you like dirt, when it calls you less than human, you learn something. You learn how to survive. And maybe you think you have all the answers. Maybe you think this bank, this empire you've built, is untouchable. But let me tell you something. It's nothing without the people who built it. It's nothing without the ones you trample over, the ones you look down on." Jessica's throat tightened as the weight of his words pressed down on her. Her skin prickled, the air around her feeling thicker and thicker by the second. She wanted to push him away, wanted to banish him from the bank like she had done so many times with others who didn't fit the mold. But something held her back. For the first time, she wasn't sure who the fool was. As the room stood frozen, he took a step closer, the sack still in his hand, its contents now spilling slightly onto the counter. Bills. Thick, crisp stacks of money. Money that had once been denied. Money that had once been earned through years of hardship, through labor, through struggle. His eyes locked with Jessica's once again, and this time, she didn't look away. "You think you've won," he said quietly, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. "But the truth will always come out." And with that, the moment hung in the air, like a storm about to break. Something was coming, something that no one could prepare for. The silence in the room stretched on, an uncomfortable weight that suffocated the air. Jessica stood frozen behind the counter, her fingers still resting on the receiver of the phone but not daring to dial. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Someone to do something? A sign that this nightmare would end? Or perhaps she was waiting for her own mind to catch up with the reality of what was unfolding before her eyes. Amos Jackson, with his sack of money and his steady gaze, didn't move. He didn't have to. He stood there like a monument to everything she'd tried so hard to ignore. He was the embodiment of every person she had ever looked down on, every person who had crossed her path and made her feel uncomfortable, like their very existence was an inconvenience. He wasn't just an old man with tattered clothes. He was a reminder of everything she had forgotten, of everything her privileged life had blinded her to. He was the reminder that the world was built on the backs of people like him, people who worked in the shadows, people who toiled while others took credit. And now, in his silence, he was reclaiming the space that had been denied him for so long. Jessica finally broke her gaze from his, her eyes darting around the room, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in. The other customers were whispering among themselves now, their faces drawn in skepticism, but a few of them were starting to squirm uncomfortably, their confidence shaken by his words. The sense of entitlement that had once been so solid and impenetrable began to crack. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, a few even lowering their eyes. The room was divided now. On one side, there were those who couldn't quite understand what was happening, who still thought this was some sort of joke. They shifted in their seats, hoping the awkward tension would pass. On the other side, there were those who were starting to feel something deep in their gut, a creeping unease. They could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, could feel the stirrings of guilt that they had long buried. One of the men, Jonathan Whitmore, a tall, well-dressed man in a sharp suit, couldn't hold it in any longer. His impatience, his ignorance, and his sense of superiority exploded in an arrogant, mocking laugh. "Are you really going to stand there, old man?" the man sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You really think you can waltz into this bank and claim it as your own? You've got no business here, none at all." His words echoed through the room, but instead of having the intended effect of putting Amos in his place, they only made the tension thicker. His face didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't look upset. Instead, there was a quiet resignation in his eyes, a knowing look that seemed to say, "I've heard it all before." Jonathan Whitmore stood rigid, his posture as straight and immovable as the towering skyscrapers outside the bank's glass windows. His suit was perfectly tailored, a deep charcoal that spoke of wealth and status, the kind of suit worn by those who knew their place in the world was secure, who believed they were born into it. His tie was knotted just so, a rich shade of red that caught the light with every movement. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked sharply against the marble floor as he stepped forward, exuding a sense of entitlement that filled the space. He had never known a world in which he wasn't at the top. The Whitmore family had been the heart of the city's wealth for generations, their influence stretching into every corner of the business world, from finance to real estate to law. He had inherited that influence along with his position in the family business. His hands had never known labor. His world had always been one of meetings in boardrooms, private jets, and expensive dinners in five-star restaurants. He lived in a realm where privilege was an unspoken rule, and those without it were invisible. He had seen people like Amos Jackson before, rarely, of course, but when he did, they were nothing more than a blur in the background of his life. He had never bothered to understand their struggles. To him, they were part of the scenery, just another invisible fixture in a city built on the backs of people like him. And now, here was the old man, standing in the middle of this pristine, polished space with nothing but his sack and a story, claiming ownership of the very institution that had funded the Whitmore family's rise to power. The Imperial Trust Bank. The name echoed through his mind as he looked at the man before him. His lips curled into a thin, dismissive smile. He had seen people like him come and go, but this one was different. He wasn't begging for charity, or simply asking for change. No, he was asserting himself, and that was something he wasn't prepared to tolerate. But Amos's face remained calm, his eyes steady. "You think I haven't worked for anything?" he asked, his voice soft, but carrying a weight that made the entire room hold its breath. "You think I haven't earned what I have? You think people like me just sit around waiting for handouts?" He paused, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. "You don't know what it's like to fight for every single scrap. To be treated like dirt your entire life, and still rise, still stand, still demand what's rightfully yours," he said, his voice getting stronger with every word. "You don't know the meaning of struggle, of real hard work. You've been handed everything on a silver platter, and now you want to tell me what I deserve." There was a moment of pure, uncomfortable silence. Jonathan Whitmore seemed to stumble, caught off guard by his words. He had expected resistance, perhaps, but not the kind that came with so much raw power, so much truth. Jessica felt something stir inside her. She had spent her entire life in a world where privilege was invisible to her. It wasn't just about the money, the status, or the power. It was the fact that people like Amos had been ignored, dismissed, and oppressed for so long. And here he was, standing in front of her, demanding what was his. And no one could deny the truth in his words. Her heart raced. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the confrontation. The old man's calmness only seemed to make the tension worse. It was as if he were speaking a truth that none of them were ready to hear. His unwavering presence seemed to defy everything Jonathan believed in, to everything he had been taught about power. For the first time in his life, he felt the ground beneath him shift. The air grew thick with something he couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps, or something worse. "Who are you to talk to me like that?" Jonathan spat, his voice rising in anger. He took a step forward, and his eyes burned with the venom of years of entitlement and superiority. "You think you can intimidate me just because you're black? Just because you have a sad little story to tell?" The words were sharp, meant to cut. They were weapons. Weapons Jonathan had used many times before, without thinking, without consequence. But this time, they didn't land the way he wanted. The room seemed to hold its breath. Jessica felt the weight of the moment, the heaviness of the words that had been spoken. Jonathan Whitmore had thrown out his racism as a weapon, expecting it to push the old man into submission, but instead, it had backfired. Amos's expression remained unchanged. His eyes locked on Jonathan's, and in that moment, Jessica saw something new in his gaze. Strength. Quiet, steady strength. "You see," the old man continued, his voice rising in power, "I've walked these streets longer than most of you. I've seen the way you treat people like me. You walk past us like we're invisible. You look down on us like we don't exist. But we're here. We've always been here, and we've built the world you live in." Each word was a hammer, striking at the pillars of Jonathan's world. The truth, raw and painful, poured out of the old man like a flood, threatening to wash away the walls of superiority that Jonathan had built around himself. He was right. Jonathan had always walked through life blind to the labor, the sweat, and the blood that had been poured into the very foundation of his success. People like Amos had been pushed to the margins, their contributions erased from the story, their lives dismissed as insignificant. And now, this man was standing before him, reminding him of all the things he had never bothered to see. Jonathan stepped forward again, his anger clouding his judgment. His voice cracked with frustration as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I've worked my whole life," he said, though it felt like the words were losing their power with every breath. "I built the Imperial Trust Bank. Me, my family, and people like you. You've always been a part of the background, a backdrop, and that's where you belong. In the background." Amos didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at Jonathan, the weight of history pressing down on both of them. "I've worked my whole life, too," he replied, his voice steady and resolute. "I've built something out of nothing. And now I'm taking back what's mine. You don't get to pretend you built this place. You don't get to erase us anymore." The words hung in the air, and the room was silent once again. Jessica watched as Jonathan, once so sure of his place in the world, faltered. His face flushed with anger and frustration, but his calm, unwavering words had struck deeper than Jonathan had anticipated. His world was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I didn't come here to ask for permission," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fire. "I came to remind you all that this place is built on the backs of people like me, people you have long forgotten." There was a long pause. Jessica, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene, felt something stirring within her. It wasn't just his words. It was the undeniable truth that lay beneath them. The bank, this building, this institution, had been built with the sweat and blood of black laborers. The city, the skyscrapers, the wealth. Everything had been built off the backs of people like him. The stark truth hit her like a slap in the face. "Who are you to talk to me like that?" Whitmore spat, his voice rising. "You think you can intimidate me just because you're black?" The words felt like a punch in the gut. The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. There was a shift, a palpable discomfort that rippled through the room. No one dared speak. The weight of the man's racism hung in the air like a suffocating blanket, stifling every breath. "You see," Amos continued, his voice growing stronger, "I've seen the way you look down on us, like we don't exist. But we're here. We've always been here, and we've built the world you live in." Jonathan, his face reddening, took a step forward. He was trying to hold on to his pride, to maintain the illusion of superiority, but the old man's words were cutting deeper than he was willing to admit. The rest of the room watched in tense silence as the confrontation escalated. Jessica couldn't look away now. She had never seen someone speak with such raw honesty before, such unflinching conviction. His words weren't just a challenge to the bank, to the customers, or to Jonathan Whitmore. They were a challenge to every institution that had oppressed people like him for generations. They were a challenge to the system that had buried black history, black lives, and black contributions beneath layers of falsehoods and denial. The room was quiet now, but the silence was deafening. Amos had spoken a truth that no one could ignore. There was no turning back from this moment. Finally, the security guard, looking unsure and increasingly uncomfortable, took a step toward Amos Jackson. But before he could say a word, the old man raised a hand, stopping him. "I've waited too long for someone to listen," he said softly. "Now, I'm here, and you will listen." Amos looked around the room at the other customers, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Look at you all," he continued, his voice louder now, filling the space with every word. "You sit there, looking at me like I'm the problem, like I'm the one who doesn't belong. But it's you, people like you, who have built this world on the backs of people like me. You've profited off our labor, off our sweat and tears, and you've done it all while telling us we don't matter, telling us we're not good enough, telling us we should be grateful for whatever crumbs you decide to toss our way." His words were cutting, like a knife slicing through the air. The customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided his gaze. Others looked at the floor, as though ashamed of what they had never considered before. The security guard, still standing near the door, looked like he didn't know whether to intervene or to just step back and let the man speak his truth. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing with determination. "You can keep your buildings, your money, your fancy suits. I'm not here for your pity, and I'm not here for your charity. I'm here to remind you that people like me, black people, poor people, the ones you've stepped on, are just as important as any of you." Jessica's chest tightened as Amos's words hit her like a punch in the stomach. She had spent so much of her life blind to the reality that people like him had lived. She had walked through this world with her head held high, thinking she deserved everything she had, thinking she had earned it all. But the truth was, she hadn't earned anything, not in the way he had, not in the way so many others had. Jonathan Whitmore scoffed, his face turning redder with every passing second. "You really think you can come in here and lecture us? You don't even belong in this bank, in this city, in this world." The words hit like a slap, but he didn't react. He simply shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice calm once more. "I don't belong here. Not in your world, not in your system. But that's the beauty of it. I've never belonged to a world that doesn't value me, and I don't need your approval to claim what's mine." The entire room seemed to exhale in unison, like they were all holding their breath and had finally been allowed to breathe again. But it wasn't just Amos's words that had shaken them. It was the fact that he had said what no one else had the courage to say, what no one had dared to acknowledge. The world they had built, the world of privilege, of wealth, of power, was built on a lie. And for the first time, someone was standing up to it. He turned to Jessica, his eyes locking with hers. "You can call the cops if you want. You can try to throw me out. But know this, you can never erase what's been done, and you can never take away the truth." His words hung in the air. The room was still, each person left alone with their thoughts, unsure of what to do, what to say, what to believe. No one spoke. No one moved, as if his words had paralyzed everyone in that bank, freezing them in time. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had just happened. The security guard, still by the door, stood there like a statue, unsure of what to do. His hands were clasped in front of him, his shoulders stiff, his eyes cast downward in what appeared to be some form of reluctant shame. Jessica stood motionless behind the counter, her mind racing. She had witnessed something she couldn't explain. Amos Jackson had come in, a broken figure with nothing to his name, and he had spoken truth, raw, painful truth, that made her question everything she thought she knew. She had always dismissed people like him. In her world, people like him were invisible. They were the other. They were the ones who didn't belong in spaces like this, in banks with marble floors and glass ceilings. But what if he was right? What if the real problem wasn't the old man standing in front of them, but the world that had built itself on the exploitation of people like him? What if the power and wealth that people in this bank took for granted had been built on the broken backs of black people, poor people, those who had never been allowed to partake in the spoils of their labor? A voice broke the silence. "Someone should call the cops," Whitmore sneered again, his words a little less confident this time. That old man can't just walk in here and talk like that. He's crazy." Jessica didn't respond. Instead, she glanced over at the group of customers who had once been smugly observing the exchange. Now, their expressions had changed. The veneer of superiority was gone, replaced with something far more uncertain. The same customers who had earlier dismissed him as a nuisance were now avoiding his words echoing in their minds. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking at their watches, tapping their feet, as if trying to avoid the truth that had been thrust upon them. "I don't know about calling the cops," another woman muttered, her voice a little softer, filled with doubt. She wasn't looking at Jessica anymore. Her gaze was distant, lost somewhere far beyond the bank's walls. "But I don't think we should just let him get away with it. He doesn't belong here." Jessica's eyes snapped to the woman, and for the first time, she could feel a change inside herself. The woman's words stung. "He doesn't belong here." But they were nothing new. She had heard it her entire life. It was the quiet, judgmental murmur that followed black men and women everywhere they went. Whether it was in a bank, a store, or a place of education, the message was always the same. You don't belong here. The woman was no different from the countless others who had looked down on her, who had made assumptions about people like the old man. Her disdain was more subtle, more insidious, but just as harmful. But as his words continued to churn in her mind, Jessica's thoughts began to shift. What if she was wrong? What if the people like her, the ones with privilege, the ones who'd never had to work for everything they had, were the real outsiders? The real intruders? A wave of guilt washed over her. She wanted to call the cops, to eject him, to return to the world where everything made sense, where everything fit in neat little boxes. But something in her, deep down, was rebelling against it. "Jessica!" The voice of the woman behind her broke through her thoughts. "You're not going to let him get away with that, are you?" Jessica didn't answer immediately. She stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the phone. She felt trapped between two worlds, the world that had always been hers, and the world that he had shown her. A world of struggle, a world of resilience, the world of people who were never given a fair shot, but still fought to claim what was rightfully theirs. Without another word, Jessica picked up the phone, her fingers trembling. She dialed the number of the bank's manager, her voice barely a whisper as she recounted the events of the morning. Her mind raced as she spoke, the weight of his presence still lingering in the air, choking her every word. Meanwhile, Jonathan Whitmore paced back and forth, still ranting about how someone needed to do something. His voice was louder now, more frantic, but there was something desperate about it. He wasn't just angry. He was terrified. He wasn't afraid of the old man. No, he was afraid of the questions he had raised, of the truth he had forced into the open. That truth had shaken him to his core. It had unsettled the foundation of everything he had ever believed. The others in the room began to murmur amongst themselves, speaking in hushed tones. A few heads nodded in agreement with Jonathan Whitmore, while others shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying the discomfort that now simmered beneath their masks of indifference. Amos Jackson had gotten to them. He had cracked the walls of the little bubble they had been living in. In the midst of this growing unease, Jessica finally set the phone down. She looked at the customers in the room, her gaze meeting theirs one by one, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been standing here, in this bank, for hours. She had been watching this scene unfold, waiting for someone else to take control. But now, she realized, she was the one who had to make a decision. "I don't think I'm calling the cops," she said quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Her voice was firm, even as it trembled. "I'm not going to throw him out." The room went still again. The woman behind her gasped. Jonathan Whitmore stopped pacing, his face flushed with a mix of disbelief and anger. It was as though they couldn't comprehend what she had just said. "You're crazy," he finally spat, his voice low and filled with venom. "You really think we're going to let a dirty old man come in here and dictate how things go?" But Jessica didn't flinch. She stood her ground, looking at the man with an expression that surprised even her. "No. I think we've been letting people like you dictate things for far too long. And it's time we listen." As she spoke, she felt something shift inside her, something she couldn't fully name yet, but something that told her she was no longer the same person who had walked into the bank that morning. The tension in the bank was palpable. Jessica felt it in the air, thick and suffocating, as Jonathan Whitmore fumed, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded. The other customers had fallen into a stunned silence, too uncomfortable to speak, their eyes nervously darting between Jessica and the old man, who had come in with nothing but a sack and a story. It wasn't just a disruption. It was a reckoning. Jessica's heart raced as the reality of the situation settled in. Amos Jackson had come in, placed the thick, weathered document on the counter, and calmly asserted that the bank was his. To anyone else, it would have seemed absurd. Just another delusional person trying to claim something that wasn't his. But his quiet confidence, the way he stood as though he were simply waiting for the world to acknowledge what it had ignored for so long, was undeniable. His calmness seemed to magnify the weight of his words. The room, once filled with the soft rustling of papers and the clink of coins, now hung with a heavy, uneasy silence. Whitmore's face contorted in disbelief, tried to regain control of the situation. His gaze darted between Amos and Jessica, disbelief and anger flashing in his eyes. His frustration was palpable, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words that would strip the old man of his audacity. The tension was almost unbearable. Jessica could see the shift happening, the subtle but undeniable discomfort spreading through the room. She could feel it in her own chest, a tightness that wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. This was more than just an old man in a dusty coat and a sack of papers. This was a reminder of everything she had ignored for years, the weight of history, the legacy of labor and exploitation, the systematic erasure of people like him who had worked, bled, and built, only to have their work stolen and rewritten by the powerful. "Jessica!" The voice of the security guard broke through her thoughts. His tone was uncertain, hesitant. "What are we doing here? He's making a scene, and we can't let him take over." But Jessica didn't respond. She couldn't. What he said, what the others in the room said, no longer mattered. She had seen the world differently now. She had seen it through the eyes of Amos, his quiet dignity, the quiet defiance in his posture. She had seen the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. "He's right," Jessica said softly, her voice gaining strength with every word. She glanced at Whitmore, her gaze unwavering. "This place was built on the backs of people like him. We can't pretend it wasn't. You can't erase that," Jonathan Whitmore sneered, his eyes flashing with contempt. He took a step closer to Amos, his posture full of aggression. The arrogance in his movements was unmistakable. He was used to getting what he wanted, to having the world bend to his will. But now, facing him, he seemed unsure for the first time. "What are you going to do?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Call the cops? Have them drag this old fool out of here? You think they'll side with him? With you? Jessica's fingers traced the edge of the document Amos had placed on the counter. It was weathered, old, and fragile, yet in her hands it felt like a tangible piece of history. She felt its weight, not just the physical weight, but the weight of the history it represented. Generations of people, their lives and labor erased, their contributions stolen. And yet, here it was, this old man, standing before them, demanding what was rightfully his. "No," Jessica said, her voice firm. "I won't call the cops. We'll do this the right way. We'll make sure this is handled properly." Jessica's mind was racing. She had no idea what the consequences would be. She knew that by standing beside Amos, by helping him, she was making herself a target. Whitmore would use every ounce of influence he had to make sure she lost her job. The bank would disown her. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze, she realized she couldn't walk away. She couldn't go back to a life where she allowed things like this to happen without raising her voice. She turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you need to make this right?" His eyes softened slightly. There was a flicker of gratitude in his gaze, though it was quickly hidden behind the quiet mask he wore. His face, weathered with years of hardship, seemed to relax for a brief moment. "I need the deeds to the property," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This bank was taken from my family years ago. The records are hidden, locked away in the vault. But they belong to me." The room fell into a hushed silence. The other customers, who had been so quick to dismiss him, now watched in wide-eyed silence. Jessica could feel the eyes of everyone on her, waiting for her to act, to do something, to fix the situation. But the truth was undeniable, and she knew, deep down, that she couldn't just turn away. The security guard, clearly uncomfortable, looked at Jessica in confusion. "What are you talking about? You can't just waltz in and take the deeds. This is insane. We'll get fired. You'll get us fired." But Jessica was resolute. She turned back to Amos, her eyes meeting his with a determination she hadn't realized she possessed. She wasn't going to let him down. She wasn't going to let this man's story be erased again, not after everything he had endured. "You've earned this," Jessica said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let's make it right. Let's get those records." Amos didn't speak, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of trust, of hope, that made Jessica feel as if she had made the right decision. She had seen enough of people like him being denied their rightful place. She wasn't going to be part of that anymore. They moved quickly. Jessica led him to the back office, her mind racing as she walked past the rows of desks. The bank's vault loomed ahead, a cold, intimidating structure. But Jessica wasn't afraid. She had a purpose now. She had a mission. With a steady hand, she used her access to the bank's systems, bypassing the security protocols. He stood beside her, his silence a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded in the front of the bank. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, but there was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet patience. The screen blinked green. The vault door clicked open. Inside, hidden away among rows of files, were the records, the deeds, the documents that proved his family's rightful ownership of the bank. Jessica took them from the shelves, holding them gently in her hands. They were more than just papers. They were his legacy, the legacy of so many people who had been ignored and erased. She turned to him, her heart pounding with anticipation. "We have it. It's yours." A slow smile spread across his face, and for the first time in what seemed like a lifetime, there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, the words thick with emotion. Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been erased by a system that had never truly seen them. And in that moment, she knew that they had just started a revolution that wouldn't be stopped by anyone. But she wasn't thinking about gratitude. She was thinking about the fight ahead. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be battles, legal challenges, and obstacles. But for the first time, she understood what she was fighting for, and she wouldn't stop until justice was done. Jessica's heart was still racing as she handed him the documents, the proof of ownership that had been taken from him and his family so many years ago. The weight of what she had just done was settling in, and with it came a deep, unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't just the satisfaction of helping someone take back what was theirs. It was something more, a dawning realization that she had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. Amos Jackson had trusted her with something monumental. He had come to the Imperial Trust Bank not just to claim his family's legacy, but to challenge a system built on exploitation. And in that moment, she knew she had to stand with him. She couldn't go back to the life she had lived before, one where she blindly accepted the privilege afforded by her position at the bank. Not after seeing how much of that privilege had been built on the oppression of people like him, people whose histories and contributions had been erased. When the deed was done, and Amos had left the bank with the rightful documents in his hands, Jessica returned to her duties. At least, that was the plan. But as she sat at her desk, her mind was spinning. She couldn't shake the look in his eyes when he had thanked her, the quiet appreciation, the flicker of trust. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much bigger, something that threatened the very foundation of the system she had been a part of. Her thoughts were interrupted when Jonathan Whitmore stormed up to the counter, his expression twisted with outrage. He had been watching the whole exchange, and from the look on his face, it was clear that he wasn't pleased with how things had gone down. "Jessica," Whitmore spat, his voice laced with fury. "You've crossed a line. I saw what you did. You let that old man walk out with those documents. What's your game? Are you trying to sabotage the bank?" Jessica froze. Her heart sank, and she swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. She had never been afraid of confrontation, but this felt different. Whitmore had been a long-time figurehead of the bank's elite clientele, his wealth and influence reaching deep into the city's power structure. She knew that standing up to him could have consequences, but she didn't realize just how severe those consequences would be until now. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady, but her insides twisted with a knot of unease. "I helped him get back what was rightfully his." "You helped him?" he sneered. "You helped him steal from this bank. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand what's at stake here?" The anger in his voice was palpable, and as much as she wanted to stand her ground, she could feel the weight of what she had done settling in. She had broken the rules of a system she had spent years upholding. And now that system was pushing back, hard. Before she could respond, the manager, Mr. Harris, appeared at her side. His stern face was flushed with anger, his jaw tight. "Jessica, can I speak with you in my office?" Her stomach churned. She knew what was coming. It wasn't just Whitmore's accusations. She had already seen how the powers that be would protect their own. They would defend their profits at any cost, even if it meant silencing anyone who threatened their control. As she followed Mr. Harris to his office, the weight of her actions became clearer. The door closed behind them, and the tension in the room grew thick. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done, Jessica?" Mr. Harris's voice was low, but filled with disappointment. "You've helped a man with no proof, no legal standing, and you've undermined everything this bank stands for. This isn't just about disobedience. This is about treason." Jessica's heart was pounding in her chest, but she held her head high. "Treason! Mr. Harris, I didn't do anything wrong. I helped someone reclaim what was taken from them." "Taken?" he scoffed. "You've taken the side of a delusional old man. Do you realize what's at stake here? We're not talking about a simple misunderstanding. This is about the power and influence of this bank, about our very survival. And you've helped to shake that foundation." The words stung. She had never questioned the bank's operations before. She had always accepted her position and the paycheck that came with it. But now she realized that she had been blind. The bank's survival wasn't about the people it served. It was about the wealth and control it ensured for those at the top. She had just helped someone fight back, and for the first time in her life, she was starting to see the system for what it truly was. "Do you know what happens now?" Mr. Harris continued, his eyes narrowing with frustration. "You're fired. We can't have someone like you working here. You've become a liability. Do you understand?" Her breath caught in her throat. Fired. Just like that. For doing the right thing. Jessica stood there, her mind racing. She had already expected the consequences, had known deep down that standing up for Amos meant risking everything. But now that it was happening, she couldn't deny the hollow ache in her chest. She had just lost her job, the very job she had clung to for years, the job that had provided her with security and stability. And it was all because she had done what felt right in her heart. "You're free to leave, Jessica," Mr. Harris said coldly, his voice dismissive. She nodded slowly, her chest tightening with a mixture of regret and something else, something deeper, something that had been growing inside her for months. As she walked out of the office, the weight of her decision settled around her like a cloak. She had lost her job, but in exchange, she had found something far more valuable: her sense of self. The world outside felt different now, sharper, clearer. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would no longer be a part of a system that thrived on the exploitation of people like Amos. She had crossed a line, yes, but she had crossed it for the right reasons. And as the door to the bank swung open behind her, Jessica took her first step into a new world, a world where she could no longer turn a blind eye. The next morning, Jessica and Amos stood outside the building, watching as the workers arrived, unaware of the storm that had hit the bank the day before. Jonathan Whitmore, still seething with anger, had tried to rally the other customers against them, but they had all scattered in the wake of the old man's victory. No one was willing to stand by him anymore. Jessica knew the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. She had helped him reclaim what was his, but there was a larger fight on the horizon, one that would stretch far beyond this bank. The world had to change, and it wasn't going to be easy. People like Whitmore would not give up power without a fight. They would do everything they could to maintain control, to hold on to what they had taken. But she was ready now. She had seen the ugliness of the system, the way it had trampled over people like Amos. She couldn't go back to the way things were, not after everything that had happened. "I won't let them take it from you," she promised him. "I won't let them erase your story again." He smiled, a look of quiet gratitude in his eyes. "It's not just about the bank, Jessica. It's about dignity, It's about people like me being seen. That's something they can never take. The next day, they went to the press. They met with reporters, with civil rights groups, with anyone who would listen. They told the story of how the bank had been built on the backs of his ancestors, how it had been taken away from them, and how they had fought to get it back. It was a story that resonated with so many people, and it spread quickly, like wildfire across the city. The media storm that followed was relentless. For weeks, they had been thrust into the spotlight. The story of how a black man had reclaimed his rightful ownership of a prominent bank in the heart of the city was too powerful to ignore. But with the spotlight came backlash, and with that backlash came hate. Jonathan Whitmore and others who had benefited from the system fought tooth and nail to discredit his claim. They labeled him a troublemaker, a radical, someone who was trying to tear down the order of things. Behind the scenes, powerful people tried to undermine his victory, filing lawsuits, lobbying politicians, and pressuring the media to spin the story in their favor. But Jessica wasn't backing down. She could feel the weight of the fight in her chest, and she was ready. He had been denied what was rightfully his for so long, and she wasn't going to let the world take it from him again. Together, they fought back. They worked tirelessly to expose the corruption in the system, to show the world the truth. They met with lawyers, with activists, with anyone who could help them push back against the people who wanted to take it all away. The pressure was overwhelming, but she didn't feel it. For the first time, she felt alive, like she was fighting for something worth fighting for. She had finally found her purpose. She wasn't just a part of the system anymore. She was part of the change. The story of how a black man had fought back against a system that had stripped him of his legacy resonated with people everywhere. It was a tale of perseverance, of reclaiming what had been unjustly taken, and for many, it was an inspiring reminder of how much could be accomplished when the marginalized finally stood up for themselves. But, behind closed doors, powerful figures in the city's elite circles met, strategizing how they could undo what had been done. The financial institutions, the investors, the people who had built their empires on the back of the old man's family's labor, all wanted to reclaim control. Jonathan Whitmore, who had once sneered at Jessica's insistence on helping Amos, was among the loudest voices. He lashed out, calling Amos's victory a fluke and accusing Jessica of misguided sympathy. The old man's claim to the bank was not just a challenge to the institution, it was a challenge to a long-standing racial hierarchy that had allowed people like him to flourish while keeping others beneath them. "Your fight isn't over, Jessica," Amos said one evening as they sat in the small office at the bank, poring over paperwork. He had a quiet wisdom in his eyes, a quiet understanding of the long road that lay ahead. "This battle isn't just about the bank. This is about what they believe we deserve. The world is still going to fight us. We've just given them a reason to fight harder." Jessica nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had thought that the hard part was over, that returning the bank to its rightful owner would be enough. But now she saw how deep the fight went. It wasn't just about property rights. It wasn't even about money. This was about dignity. This was about the way people like him had been forced to take a back seat for so long. He had been robbed of his place in the world, and now that he was reclaiming it, there were those who would go to any lengths to stop him. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. It was a call from her lawyer, and when she answered, his voice was grim. "Jessica, you need to prepare yourself," he said. "They've filed an injunction. They're trying to halt the bank's operations until a full investigation into the ownership can be conducted. They're pulling every string they can." Jessica felt her stomach drop. Amos had won the legal battle for the bank, but the powerful forces behind the scenes were far from giving up. They would stop at nothing to erase the truth, to deny him his rightful place. "They won't succeed," Jessica said, her voice more certain than she felt. "We've come too far. We can't give up now." The following days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. The opposition grew more intense. Powerful media figures spun the story to paint him as a radical who was attempting to destabilize the economy by taking ownership of the bank. They brought in racial undertones, painting the fight as one of class warfare, and accusing Amos of stirring up tensions between races. Jessica knew it was nothing more than a smokescreen, a deliberate attempt to turn public opinion against them. But she wasn't fooled. She knew the truth, and more importantly, the public was starting to see it too. He had never asked for a fight. He hadn't asked to be seen. But in the eyes of the world, his struggle became a reflection of the larger fight for racial justice. Amos, who had spent decades on the fringes of society, ignored the whispers of the powerful and their attempts to undermine his victory. He knew they couldn't take away the truth. The records were there, the deeds to the bank, the documents, the proof of ownership. They were irrefutable. And as long as those records existed, the fight would continue. Jessica worked tirelessly to defend their claim. She met with civil rights leaders who rallied behind his cause. They shared his story on social media, in town halls, and to the press. Slowly but surely, the public sentiment began to shift. People began to understand that this wasn't just about his ownership of a building. It was about history. It was about the rights of those who had been denied their place for so long. But the pushback from the wealthy elites continued. One particularly powerful figure, a wealthy banker with a long history of supporting the political establishment, took to the airwaves, calling Jessica and Amos troublemakers who were out to tear down the very fabric of the system. His words were sharp, dismissive, and pointed, intended to make Jessica and Amos appear as threats to the established order. "Let them say what they will," he said one evening as they watched the news together. "They always call us troublemakers. They've called every person like me a troublemaker. But we're not trouble. We're truth. And the truth has a way of coming out." But his fight wasn't without sacrifice. With every victory, the pressure mounted. The attacks from those in power became more personal, targeting not just his ownership of the bank, but his dignity as well. He was painted as a man who didn't know his place, as someone who didn't understand the order of things. Jessica knew she couldn't let this fight go on forever. He deserved peace. He deserved to enjoy the fruits of his labor, to walk in the world with his head held high, without the constant weight of resistance bearing down on him. They had come so far, but the fight had only just begun. There was no time to relax. The opposition wasn't done. They had already begun to mobilize again, filing motions to appeal, calling for another round of hearings, determined to strip him of his hard-won victory. The wealthy elites, the ones who had always held the reins of power, weren't ready to relinquish their control so easily. They couldn't stand the thought of someone like him, someone from the very bottom of society, reclaiming what had been stolen from him. Jessica could feel the weight of it all. The media, once supportive, now began to backpedal, letting the whispers of the opposition creep into their headlines. The language started to change. They weren't simply reporting on a victory anymore. They were casting doubt on its legitimacy, suggesting that the court had made a mistake, that this wasn't how things were supposed to be. But she knew better. She knew that this wasn't just a fight for one man's ownership of a bank. It was a fight for the truth. It was a fight for every person who had ever been overlooked, for every black person whose contributions had been erased. The battle was never about the building. It was about reclaiming a seat at the table. It was about the acknowledgement that their lives, their histories, mattered. Jessica and Amos were determined to face whatever came next, head on. They met with their legal team every day, preparing for the inevitable pushback. They worked tirelessly to keep the media in their corner, to remind the public that Amos's family had built the bank. It wasn't a simple story of wealth. It was a story of history, of stolen legacy, and of resilience. But the wealth and influence that their opponents held began to wear on them. The challenges kept coming. Courtroom delays, motions to dismiss, legal loopholes. But every time they took a step forward, they stood firm. They were fighting for more than just the bank. They were fighting to make sure the system didn't erase their story again. Finally, after months of constant battle, the court scheduled a final hearing. His enemies, who had once been so certain of their victory, were now growing more frantic. Their legal arguments were weakening. The public support for his case was growing. They knew the tide was turning, and they were starting to lose their grip. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and supporters who had been following the case since the beginning. Amos Jackson, now in his mid-70s, stood tall, as if all the years of hardship had somehow built him stronger. He was ready for this moment, the moment when he would no longer be denied. Jessica stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder for support. She knew how much this meant, not just for him, but for everyone who had been denied a voice, for the entire black community that had been told their place was at the bottom. It wasn't just a bank, it wasn't just property. This was about proving, once and for all, that their struggle had not been in vain. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered. The weight of the moment was palpable. The judge, an elderly man who had seen his fair share of cases, looked down at the papers in front of him. He glanced at both parties and the attorneys present, his face unreadable. He had seen the arguments, he had heard the back and forth, and now it was time to decide. "The court has reviewed the evidence and the motions presented," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "The ownership of the bank, as determined by the original documents and the historical records, is legally and rightfully the property of Mr. Jackson and his family. The actions that led to its unlawful seizure must be addressed, and restitution is due." The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, a wave of disbelief seemed to ripple through the opposition's camp. Jonathan Whitmore, who had been so certain that his wealth and influence could crush the old man's claim, looked utterly defeated. His face went pale, his mouth agape in shock. The judge looked up, meeting Amos's gaze with quiet respect. "The bank is yours, Mr. Jackson. The ruling stands." A collective breath seemed to escape the room. For Amos, it was as if the years of struggle and hardship had come to an end in that one moment. He had fought for so long to prove that he mattered, to prove that his family's legacy was worth something. And now, at last, it had been acknowledged. His place in the world had been restored. Jessica's eyes welled with tears. She had been with him through every moment of this journey, and now, as she looked at him, she saw not just a man who had reclaimed his bank, but a man who had reclaimed his dignity. He had stood tall, fought for what was rightfully his, and had made the world see him, not as an afterthought, but as someone who mattered. The press erupted in a frenzy, their cameras flashing as they captured the moment. He stood up, his hand gripping the back of the chair in front of him. There was no celebratory shout, no grand gesture. There was just the quiet strength of someone who had won a battle against a system that had tried to break him. As he walked out of the courtroom, Jessica by his side, she could see the weight lifting off his shoulders. The road ahead was still long, but they had reached the summit. The battle had been won, not just for the bank, but for every person who had been made invisible, for every story that had been buried. Justice had been served, and it had been long overdue. For the first time in Jessica's life, she felt like she was on the right side of history. She had helped him reclaim not just a building, but his dignity. She had helped him take back his place in a world that had always tried to erase him. And with each passing day, Amos's smile grew brighter. He had his bank back, but more than that, he had his dignity. He had his place in the world, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have to fight to be seen. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.